Let me just start by saying that this theory that the temple is not on the Temple Mount, that in the city of David, originated with Dr. Ernest Martin, was involved with a number of projects that kind of went to the edge. Many scholars did not accept his findings, but he was one of those that was trying to push the boundaries. And this was the book that he wrote called The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. This was published in the late 1999, and he writes, "Now is the time to remove this profound ignorance and forgetfulness. What we now know from these new archaeological and biblical discoveries is this. Though the whole world over the past generations has forgotten where the original Temple of Solomon was constructed, we are now assured that the temples of Solomon, Zerubbabel, and Herod were built just above the once fresh and pure waters of the Gihon Spring, located on the southeast of Jerusalem." And this is the way he would construct his image of the way the temple looked. In the place of the historic Temple Mount, he would put the Antonia Fortress. He would do this based on his understanding of what a Roman fort looked like, the size of a Roman fort. As you'll see, one problem with that is he is drawing his model of the Roman forts from the 2nd century, the time of Hadrian and beyond, not from the 1st century. And so this is not the model that Herod used. At the same time, he talks about different types of things that connect the Temple Mount with this structure. And he talked about 600-foot bridges that he said Josephus mentioned. Josephus does not mention 600-foot bridges, and I'll mention some of that later. But you'd see he had placed the temple above the Gihon Spring with the argument that you need some kind of spring water, living water, flowing upward in order to facilitate all of the sacrificial needs of the temple. So this is the model we come up with. In recent years, we've had books that have followed this train of thinking. One is called Jerusalem's Temple Mount, the Hoax of the Millennium. And that's why I titled my message, Is the Temple Mount the Hoax of the Millennium? This author, Mike Joseph, says, shocking as it may sound, though Jerusalem is the holy city, what is believed to be the location of the Temple Mount is nothing, though unintentionally, but a hoax. The hoax of the millennium. And so this is the contention he makes. Another book is Jerusalem's Temple Mount, a myth. Okay, not is it, but it is, according to this. And then one that many of you have read by a local teacher here, Robert Cornuke. In this introduction to the book, it says, this book is being heralded as an investigative masterpiece with astounding archaeological and prophetic implications, sending shockwaves through the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian worlds. Can you imagine the upheaval in political and religious thinking if the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is not the site of Solomon and Herod's temples, if the stones of the Wailing Wall are not what tradition says? And so he rightly understands that this kind of view does affect geopolitics and Bible prophecy. A book that is not yet published, it's been delayed in publication, is by a scholar, George Wesley Buchanan, waiting to see what he's going to say about this. But his view is somewhat similar. And then we've had a number of DVDs, one, Jerusalem, Lost Temple of the Jews, another one, Jerusalem and the Lost Temple of the Jews. And again, the idea, is this really the actual site for the temple? Could the Jews possibly be mistaken? Is there confusion concerning the site of their temple, preventing the return of Christ? So this is a very pivotal subject, and we need to get it right. Now, the question you might ask is, why should this matter? I mean, why are we involving ourselves in maybe the question of the location of the temple? Really, in the end, what does it matter? Well, let me explain why it should matter. First, truth cannot be advanced by error, any kind of error. It doesn't have to be biblical error. It can be historical error. It could be other kinds of error. And the scripture says, 1 John 2:21, I'm not written to you because you know the truth, but because you don't know the truth, because you do know it. In other words, we look for things that are not correct, not with all the mistakes they may have, but we go to the actual truth. That's the model. And the more you understand the Word of God and are accurate in understanding the Word of God, the easier you can say what is not accurate as people portray things in the Word of God. He says, because no lie is of the truth. I'm not saying these are lies, but they are, in a sense, errors. And 1 Timothy, in 1 and 2 Timothy, says the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, a sincere faith. And at the end it says, there are those who at the end time will not endure sound doctrine. They want their ears to be tickled. They will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires, who will turn their ears away from truth and turn aside to myths. Now that's in fact what the theory I'm going to be critiquing says about the current historic Temple Mount, and the belief that the Jewish people forgot where their temple was. And instead, they have embraced a myth, the myth that it is on the present Temple Mount. A second reason this should matter is because believers are responsible to critique other believers. Paul writes, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? So we have a responsibility not to criticize and malign, but in a discerning way to understand what people are saying and point out what might not be correct. Paul says also, examine everything carefully, hold fast to what is good. And a third reason is that sensationalist claims adversely affect the unity of the body of Christ. And you can decide whether it's sensationalist or not, but when you talk about it sending shockwaves throughout the entire world and affecting geopolitics and Bible prophecy, I think that is certainly sensational in and of itself. Proverbs says there are 6 things the Lord hates, those who sow discord among brothers. Now, that may not be the intention, but it certainly can be the result. And the one that I want to focus on is skepticism toward Jewish history and tradition, as though this were something bad, this were something wrong. Paul writes again, now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. And these traditions are not necessarily all biblical. They're oral traditions. Sometimes they're passed along. A good one, for example, it says, has not the Lord Jesus told us, it's better to give than to receive. That's not anywhere in the Gospels, but it's something that Jesus said is a tradition in that sense, but it's backed up and certainly inspired by the Spirit of God. He says, so then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions as you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by letter. And of course, the whole Old Testament, from which our English Bibles are translated, is full of tradition. That is, in the vowel pointing and the accentuation of that. That comes to what we call Masoretic tradition. That's why it's called the traditional text. All of this was passed down orally and then recorded, and we depend on that for translating the Bible itself. So nothing wrong with tradition. Results sometimes in biblical truth being sidelined. In other words, the aim of our charge, as Paul also writes, is love from a pure heart, conscience and sincere faith. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered into vain discussion. Now, I hope we're not going to be involved in vain discussion. My intention is to simply show you why the historic Temple Mount is, in fact, the site that from, shall we say, time immemorial, has been the one and only site. Well, that's confirmed biblically and historically and archaeologically. But I want to say, as I mentioned here, that this also should matter because there's serious religious and political ramifications for those who hold this view. If you argue concerning prophecy and your idea is we can now build the temple, Jews can build the temple because there's no conflict with the Muslims because now it should be in the city of David, without even recognizing the city of David is one of the most conflicted areas. The Solomonic village is probably the most radical area for Muslims and for those who hate Zionists and Israel. So that really wouldn't help. But if the idea is that, then you provoke people, motivate people to start doing something that could have severe political and cultural repercussions. And so what the view actually does is lend support from the Christian world to the Islamic revisionist history that denies the temples ever existed. They say it's all fiction. And this Islamic temple denial is what we have today as a doctrine. It's unswervable. Everybody who is a Muslim authority has to hold to this. Now, they may not believe it, but they have to hold to it in an official way. Here's some examples. This is the chief Palestinian justice, Sheikh Tassir Tamimi. He's the second most important Palestinian cleric after Muhammad Hussein, the Grand Muslim of Jerusalem. He says, Israel started since 1967 making archaeological digs to show Jewish signs to prove the relationship between Judaism and the city. They found nothing. There is no Jewish connection to Israel before the Jews invaded in the 1880s. Did you know that? About these so-called two temples, they never existed, certainly not at the Temple Mount. And so if now we have the Christian world saying, well, I agree with that. They weren't at the Temple Mount. They used that to further their own ends in revising history. He says, all this is not real. We don't believe in your versions. Your Torah was falsified. Here is a man I interviewed. We have him on one of our films. He was the former Palestinian Mufti, Sheikh Karma Sabri. He said, there's not the smallest indication of the existence of a Jewish temple on this place in the past. In the whole city, there's not a single stone indicating Jewish history. Of course, this is why you should go and see those stones for yourself and have someone who's competent to connect the dots for you, because they walk around those sites every day and they see those same stones. And you ask them what they are, they say, oh, these are pre-Islamic. What does that mean? We don't know. It could be Roman, it could be Christian. But they'll never say it's Jewish. They'll never say it's related to the history of Israel. So let me just start with the arguments. And the first is why the temple is not in the city of David is because the location of the temples were never lost to Judaism. The claim that somebody could forget their most holy site, I think is an incredible statement. There's an unbroken chain of Jewish testimony that has uniformly maintained the site of the temples on the historic Temple Mount. For instance, let's just see from the archaeological point of view, Jody Magnus, who is professor of early Judaism at the University of North Carolina, a very well-known archaeologist, she says, I know of no credible scholars who question the existence of two temples or who deny they stood somewhere on the Temple Mount. 100% of the Israeli archaeologists, especially the ones involved in those areas, say the same thing. No doubt, no question. Now, here is a statement. I'm reading this out of a fellow brother's newsletter, and this is a statement that's being made about religious traditions. And notice the statements. Having a tradition challenged is never comfortable and yet essential if you really want to get at the truth. That is, truth seekers avoid tradition. They go beyond tradition. They go outside of tradition. But is tradition of no value to us? Tradition, affirmed by history and by archaeology, is where we get our information. Here is another commentator in this same particular newsletter saying, breaking free from the shackles of emotionally held traditions is always going to be difficult, especially if you have a personal investment in that belief. That is, if you're an archaeologist, if you've published books on this, if you've written things. And so he says, sadly, tradition has a way of binding and blinding its devotees, which subsequently obscures the pathway to truth. Real discovery is only possible when we blind our prejudice and allow ourselves to be guided by facts rather than feelings, which open the door to a whole new way of viewing biblical truths and sites. Now, I'd have to ask, who is an archaeologist or a historian does not regard facts? Who only deals with feelings? I mean, there's an objective side to this. I really don't understand the statement. But here's an answer from Orthodox Judaism. Rabbi Chaim Richman is with the Temple Institute. He's, since 1987, been involved with those who are seeking to rebuild the temple. And so at the core of this is where the temple is going to be located. And so they must know what the historic place is. I won't read all of his statement, but it was the main statement I've analyzed. He says, in the course of 2,000 years, the Jewish people have never forgotten the temple. The dream of rebuilding the temple spans 50 generations of Jews, 5 continents, innumerable seas and oceans. How could the Jewish people forget the holy temple? Throughout their generations, they faithfully swore, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her skill. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I remember thee not, if I set not Jerusalem above my chiefest joy. How could anyone say the Jews forgot the site to which they have prayed 3 times a day since the temple was built? And that was commanded in 1 Kings 8:35. When you pray toward this place, I will hear in heaven. And so this was the obligation. If you could forgot where to pray, forgot which direction to turn, forgot where the temple was. If you go to the Mount of Olives, you'll see 3,000 years of Jewish graves on the Mount of Olives facing the Temple Mount. That argues for a recognition of the sacred site. Here's Gershon Solomon. He is the head of the Temple Mount faithful, again speaking about tradition, and he's very much aware of this current theory. He says, I've been extremely surprised to learn about a very strange theory that has been put forward in recent years that incorrectly claims that the location of the first and second holy temples was not on Mount Moriah, the location of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the place that has always been well known to everyone until today. And then he goes on to say, the location, according to the word of God, cannot be changed or moved to any other place. Indeed, it never was moved to any other place. Now, if we go back, simply looking at the biblical account and history, Maimonides in Mishnah Torah says, once the site of the temple was fixed in the days of Samuel and King David, it could not be changed. And we find this when we come to Ezra, when Cyrus tells the Jewish people there in Babylon that they may return to their city of Judah and rebuild the temple. He says, take the vessels, go put them in the temple, which is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its original site. They would have had to know where that original site was. And then they came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem. In fact, Ezra says the heads of the fathers' households, when they arrived at the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem, offered willingly for the house of God to restore it on its foundation. They didn't go build it somewhere else. They couldn't. The Shekinah glory of God had come and filled the Holy of Holies. And when it left, Ezekiel prophesied that one day it would return in just the same way it left. Following the same route it departed, it will return and enter the Holy of Holies. So it has to come back to the same place. That place has been consecrated and sanctified by God's own glory. It says here in Ezra 9:9, to restore it on its ruins. And so they had to know exactly where that first temple was destroyed and find its foundations. So the rebuilding of the second temple took place exactly the same place as that of the first. Now, this is a book, The Archaeology of Jerusalem, from its origins to the Ottomans. These authors say this, I think it's very important. Maintaining the sanctuary's location throughout changes of cultural and religious domination is a well-established custom in antiquity. In Jerusalem, we can physically trace this continuity on the Haram Sharif, where the Dome of the Rock sits on top of the Temple Mount enclosure. Historical evidence suggests that Herod's temple was built in place of Zerubbabel's temple, which had been constructed soon after the return from Babylonian exile, and was meant to commemorate the exact spot of the first temple. The monumental construction of pre-Hellenistic extension of the eastern enclosure wall has been identified as the original Temple Mount platform, which was designed to level off natural topography in order to support the earlier temple. So he's simply saying it was very important to maintain a sanctuary's location. The first holy temple, as the second temple, were the destination for pilgrims. Okay, you have many of our psalms or psalms of ascent going up for these pilgrimage festivals, and they had to know where they were going. They were called by God to come 3 times a year during the festivals of Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot, and so that's when they went. You can still see some of these roads that were carved for the pilgrims. This one is near Beit Horon, near Jerusalem. And so they walked down these paths. We know that the walk started from the city of David. It continued along the ascending slope up to the top of the mountain where the Holy Temple Mount is located until today, in order to worship God. This was the idea. And these pilgrims came in great numbers. During the Second Temple period, the numbers of the Jewish pilgrims coming was so great that the area of the Holy Temple itself was not large enough to include the pilgrims. Herod enlarged the surface area, extending it to the south and to the north so that it would hold as much as 500,000 pilgrims who ascended to the Temple Mount. Okay, this is part of what we know. We also know that in the first century, Christianity did not abandon the temple. It knew where it was. The first Jewish Christians knew this. We see this in Luke. And after they worshiped him, this is after Jesus made the ascension to heaven, it says they returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple, praising God. Paul says, I came into the temple, I was praying and fell into a trance. Paul later says, I went into the temple and offered sacrifices. And then Paul says at the end of his life, at his own defense, I've committed no offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple. So as a good, faithful Jew, the temple was extremely important to him, and it was important to early Jewish Christianity because it was the focal point of prayer and worship for God. There's nothing wrong with the temple. The temple didn't do anything wrong. Jesus called it his Father's house. And so Jews didn't forget it, Christians didn't forget it. But as we move on, this is a very important thing to note. This is Lowenberg's article, Did Jews Abandon the Temple Mount? Now, after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, the common thinking is Jews just were thrown out of the country, went all around the world, didn't know what was going on in Jerusalem. That's not the case. He says, contrary to what many believe, Jews did not abandon the Temple Mount after the temple's actual destruction in 70 AD. There is even evidence that sacrifices continued for some time on a surviving altar. It was only after the Bar Kokhba revolt, around 132 to 135 AD, that Jews were barred from the site and from Jerusalem by the victorious and vindictive Emperor Hadrian. But they were there up until that time. Here he goes on to say, the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 AD did not spell the end of Jewish activities on the Temple Mount. For many centuries, Jews continued their attachment to the site by maintaining a physical presence on the mountain. And when they were prevented from doing so, they prayed 3 times a day for the speedy renewal of the sacrificial system in a restored temple. Despite the conventional wisdom that Jewish people were banished from this holy site, the evidence suggests that Jews continued to maintain a strong connection to and even frequently a presence on the Temple Mount for the next 2,000 years. Even when they were physically prevented from ascending the site, their attachment to Har Habayat, that is the Temple Mount, remained strong and vibrant. And to this we have to add that the entire Jewish communities, we get the idea that Jews left Jerusalem. No, there was always a Jewish community in Jerusalem. Okay? They suffered, they were marginalized, they were certainly occupied and under a foreign force, but they stayed because this is the holy city. You can't abandon it. Same thing happened in Hebron, same thing happened in Tiberias. And these Jewish communities write other Jewish communities in the diaspora, in the outside the land of Israel, and communicate and talk about these things. So we know they were there. So how could they lose this knowledge, okay, if they never left the site? Now, let's look at the Temple Mount. It was turned into a dump, and this happened with Queen Helena. You see in this picture the desolate Temple Mount. You see the Eastern Cardo, which was designed to go right by the Temple Mount, so that in this period of time, Byzantine Christians could actually have an object lesson to say, look, God cursed the Jews, God destroyed their temple, and so it'll never be rebuilt, and it's become the refuse dump that it is. So this is where it is. We can see, for instance, what Constantine said to Eusebius at the Council of Nicaea. He said, let us have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd, for we have received from our Savior a different way. And so it shouldn't be strange that his mother, Queen Helena, when she went to find the sacred sites for Christianity, would also then desolate the Jewish sites in contrast to Christianity. And it was her order to turn this site into a dump. Again, because it was the site of the temple. They didn't go throw the trash in the city of David, they threw it on the Temple Mount. And it was this very dump that was found when we come to the Muslim period. But she does this because of her feeling. So which is more plausible? That Helena, the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, would have turned the site of a former Roman fortress into a city dump, or that she would have done this to the site of the temple? You understand what I'm saying? All right. Now, here's the excavation of this area. In fact, I and my wife both worked with a team from Liberty University on this very excavation called the Kotel excavations. And you can see these very sites. Here's the Temple Mount. Here's the Eastern Cardo. We uncovered this street, and it's the very street we talked about. And it's entered by the dung gate. And the dung gate has its name because refuse and dung were brought to throw on the Temple Mount. So it became the city trash dump. Now, when we come to the year 583 or 585, something like this, 538, pardon me, is the year that Muslims take over Jerusalem. And we have a story of the Caliph Omar, who comes to the site, and a Jewish Christian priest named Sophronos knew this was the city dump because what Omar was looking for was the site of the temple. And he took him to this site, and it was cleared. And then on this site, in the year 691, was erected the Dome of the Rock by his successor, Caliph Abd al-Malik bin Wan. Caliph Abd al-Malik bin Wan even appointed or anointed 10 Jewish families and gave them responsibilities of guardianship of the Holy Temple Mount in the name of the Jewish people. Until today, the Muslims call the Temple Mount Bayt al-Maqdis, which is the Arabic term for the Hebrew Beit HaMikdash. That fact alone would tell you that there's this continuity in history, that the site and the name of the site did not change. Now, let me give you an example of that. In the 4th century AD, there was an event that happened in Jerusalem. Julian the Apostate rose. He was a Roman emperor, but he was a pagan Roman emperor. He didn't like Christianity. He didn't necessarily like Judaism, but he thought the way to get back to paganism was sacrifice. The Jews offered sacrifices, the Christians did not. And so he is going to give the Jews permission to rebuild the temple. And so this is part of history. And Jews were coming from the diaspora with the intention of joining Jews in Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And we have the record of this. There's an inscription on this wall, which is right near Robinson's Arch on the southwestern wall of the Temple Mount. And the inscription is a citation of Isaiah chapter 66, verse 14. You shall see, your heart shall rejoice, your bones shall flourish like grass. It's a picture of the restoration of Israel, which this particular pilgrim coming back to Jerusalem believed was going to happen when the Jews rebuilt the temple. And it's carved right there on the wall. He didn't go down to the city of David looking for the temple to be rebuilt there and write his message there. He wrote it right here. And so it tells us this reflects the hope of a 3rd century Jew who believed that the Roman emperor would allow the temple to be rebuilt. Well, it didn't happen. There was an explosion on the Temple Mount. It was deemed that God didn't want this to happen, and so it didn't happen. It certainly wasn't the right time. Now, here is a bit of history. Again, the people who write these books do not interact with this history, and they certainly don't interact with the archaeology. But here is Sebeos. This was written in the year 660 AD, and here's what he says. He says, I will relate a little more about the intentions of the rebellious Jews, who having either received help from the leaders of the children of Hagar, conceived a plan to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. Having discovered the place, which is called the Holy of Holies, they then built on its foundations a place of prayer for themselves. However, the Ishmaelites, jealous of them, drove them from this place and called it their house of prayer. And what he's saying here now in this 7th century is that where this Dome of the Rock was built is the place the Jews identified as the temple. See, I'm taking you through history from the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, now into the 6th and 7th century, and there's been no loss of information as to where the temple was located. In fact, we know this. When the Jews were banned from Jerusalem because of the Second Jewish Revolt, they were allowed to return once a year, all the way from the 2nd century through the Ottoman Turkish period. And they came to the Mount of Olives to commemorate on Tisha B'Av, the commemoration of the destruction of the temple. And they stood on the Temple Mount and looked over the ruins, or at least later, first the ruins and then later the place where the Muslim shrines were. This is recorded in history. They didn't go to the city of David. They couldn't see anything from there. This is where they went. Now, because of the unbroken hope to rebuild, the place of rebuilding could not have been in doubt. The exact spot of the Holy of Holies on the Temple Mount has been debated, but never has any rabbi, historian, or archaeologist argued that this 35-acre platform was not the Temple Mount. Never, all right? And those who want to rebuild the temple The temple movement, and after 25 years of meticulous research on the temple based on original historical and religious sources, had determined the only place to rebuild the third temple is on the modern Temple Mount. They know it'd be easy to build it somewhere else, but they can't, because all their sources, and all their history, and all their traditions say this is the place. Now, that's so much for tradition and history. Let's go to some of the other things that you'll see in some of these books that deal with this theory. First, the site of Zion is misunderstood. It's thought to only be the city of David. And a correct understanding of the term in history and also the location of threshing floors corrects these authors' basic error. So when we look at the scriptures here, we're coming to 701 BC. The sons of Korah write Psalms 48. And in the first two verses, here's what we read. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of the earth, Mount Zion, in the north, far north, it says, the city of the great king. Now, this is already the 8th century BC. Okay, this is later in time, and now the Temple Mount has expanded, not the Temple Mount, but the location of Zion has moved from the city of David up to the north, okay, and Mount Zion is located on the north side of Jerusalem. And it is identified as beautiful in elevation. Okay, if you notice all these other books, they put the temple below David's palace. That doesn't seem to fit. So let's talk about that for a minute. David's palace was located at a lower elevation than the temple because David honored the Lord and would never usurp his glory by putting his palace or house above God's. We know David built his palace in the city of David, therefore the next higher place has to be the top of Mount Moriah. In fact, the Gihon Spring and the tiny area of the Siloam Pool are not on a mountain or even a mountain. Okay, so if they're not a mountain, how can they be called his holy mountain? Can't be. Has to be in a higher elevation. And if you look at this, the bedrock under the side of the temple is 118 feet lower than the highest point of Mount Moriah, because God also doesn't place his temple at the highest point because pagan temples were there. He's always making this contrast with those who do not know God. And it's actually lower than the surrounding mountains. Those surrounding mountains were identified as high places in Scripture. We have the hill of evil counsel and the hill of scandal or corruption, these type of things that are surrounding. Now, when we come to the prophetic future, it's interesting. It says, after Messiah has come and established his earthly kingdom under the new covenant, we have a different situation. Isaiah 2:2. It shall come to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It should be lifted up above the hills. Well, why would that be? Because under the new covenant, you have only believers. You don't have any contrast with pagan religious high places or people. And so those former contrasts are gone. That's why we have, it's not the old law, now it's the new law, the new covenant, which is in effect. All right, let's look at this. The Antonia Fortress is at the highest point on the Mount Moriah. The lower point is the temple. This fits what we know. According to Josephus, the Antonia Fortress was 600 feet square, as was the temple, same size, and immediately located south of the temple and connected to it. The temple and the Antonia together only occupied a portion of the modern Temple Mount. Josephus, this first century historian, stated that the Antonia was on the highest part of the mount. By contrast, the temple was not on the highest point. These dimensions fit the archaeological picture drawn on the present Temple Mount, but do not agree with a theoretical drawing of a Roman fort 3 times the size of the temple. So let's move to the subject of a threshing floor. Ornan the Jebusite had a threshing floor. We say it says on Mount Moriah because 2 Chronicles 3:1 are quite clear. It connects the dots for us. Solomon again began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place where David had prepared the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So because an angel had appeared there and had not destroyed Jerusalem. He built an altar there and gave sacrifices there. That becomes now a sacred spot. Probably the same spot where Abraham came and brought Isaac. So when we look at a threshing floor, and it says David there built the altar, threshing floors are located outside a city, because who wants to live in a city with all these people throwing chaff in the air and it blowing all over them? You don't do that. You do it outside the city. Threshing floors to catch the wind are usually on a high place. We have exceptions with Bethlehem and Gibeon, but you know Gibeon's hiding in a hole in order to not be seen by the Midianites. A threshing floor near the Gihon spring could not catch the gentle evening breeze for winnowing the wheat and chaff. The ideal location for a threshing floor in Jerusalem would be the area of Mount Moriah. So this is the case. If you look at the diagram of this, it's here, not here, because threshing floors generally outside a city, generally on top of hills, not down below. But this is what these authors try to argue. And again, when we look at the place where the temple was built, it's on Mount Moriah, a mountain, and where there's also a threshing floor. These two things have to fit. Looking at a past picture of the city of David with the Ophel and the Temple Mount and the present situation, you can understand this. Now, the third reason why the temple was not in David's city is because David's city is inadequate for the placement of the original temple platform of the first temple and the expanded platform of the second. Now, let's just look at a picture of this. The original Solomonic Temple Mount was a square 500 by 500 cubits. That's 861 feet square. The second temple was built upon the same square, and Josephus confirms the shape and adds that it was built on top of a hill. On top of a hill, not down, where the Kidron Valley is. Whatever location one argues for the temple, it must be able to accommodate this size platform. So we also know when King Herod was involved. Herod built an extensive platform with huge retaining walls to bear the weight of the fill and of the structures to be built above it. It was trapezoid in shape. He changed the shape of the original square Temple Mount by adding to it. He did this to impress the Roman world, which had impressive temples of its own. But he wanted to, and they said, who's never seen Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful building in all his life. So he wanted that kind of accolade. A temple smaller than a Roman fort would not serve this purpose. Now, here's what the 500 cubit Temple Mount would have looked like. And let's take those dimensions, and here we see a cutaway, so you can see what it would look like if you were looking at it with everything cut away. And then here's the way we see it today. This is the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. You see the eroding addition to the south. You see the addition from the Hasmonean period to a little bit to the north of that. And then there's the original eastern wall that was not changed from the time of the first temple. It's on the same line exactly. Nothing has deviated from that. So when we look at these things and look at the dimensions here, the south wall were 918 feet, the west wall 1,591 feet, on and on. The total circumference of the sacred precinct was 5,052 feet, total area 172,000 square yards. This is a lot of area, and it was, comparing it to temples in the ancient world, twice as large as the monumental Forum Romanum built by Trajan, 3.5 times larger the combined temples of Jupiter and Astarte Venus at Baalbek. Okay, surface area was between 35 and 36 acres, and that only reflects a portion of the Herodian enlargement. Now, if we take those dimensions and place them on an ordnance survey, this is an exact ordnance survey done by Captain Charles Wilson, we can see the situation. Okay, here's the green, that's the present Temple Mount, and how that square would fit. Now let's move that down into the city of David, and you see, well, it covers the Iron Age houses that would be there. It covers the cemetery that is on one side of the Kidron Valley. It covers part of the Kidron Valley, blocking it off. If you were to put a temple there, that would be significant in terms of the rainwater and everything that came in. It just doesn't fit, okay? Bob Cornuke has a far too small square in his book. But he claims there's this bridge, which is non-existent from the archaeological and even the historical realm. So you can see it just doesn't fit. Okay, covers temple houses, covers temple tombs, blocks the Kidron Valley. Now, a fourth reason is the archaeological evidence, and I want to spend time with this. This, I think, is decisive, because the first thing I want to look at is the presence of a city dump from the Second Temple period on this site. Many people don't know this information. It's relatively new. But the city dump of Jerusalem began in the late Second Temple period and ended at the time of the First Jewish Revolt. So in the year 66, when the Jewish Revolt began, city authorities had lost control of civil affairs, so they couldn't, as you know, today it's the municipality that controls the garbage system. Individuals don't do that. And if they lose control, the garbage is going to pile up. So, but it ended at this point. There's no coins beyond the year 66 found at this site. Now, here's what's there. There is a total accumulation, and you can see the gold area showing it, starting at the southeastern slope of the Temple Mount and going down, covering the entire city of David. It covered 200,000 cubic meters. That's 7,062,933 feet to a depth of 30 feet. Okay, this is garbage that was thrown for a period of some 200 years, and it covers the city of David. Now, they put a retaining wall around the Gihon Spring to keep it from flowing into that, and that retaining wall is still there. But this dump is still there. Now, let me just ask you, would someone, if the temple was located there, throw the garbage of the city there? This was considered already outside of the city in those days. The fact that these debris layers cover the entire area of the city of David means there had not been and was not then a temple there. No one throws garbage on a sacred site visited by thousands of worshipers and pilgrims. If the Romans had dismantled the entire temple, as these authors claim, so there's not one stone left standing, they dismantled the entire thing, then you would have found traces of that. They'd be what we call robbers' trenches, intrusive cuts into the layers, massive disturbance of the dump layers. But when you come to it, there's nothing. It's pristine. Nothing's been disturbed. It's at a 30-degree angle. It's in perfect shape. Nothing happened down there. So how do you put a temple down there? We have other dumps like this. We have a dump, you can see it right outside of the eastern wall near the Lion's Gate. This dump went down right across the highway that's there today into an area where the Franciscans were preparing a place for the Pope when he came, and they excavated there. And I'll show you later some of the things I and my team found from this dump, which show that it's clearly from the Temple Mount. But the biblical references imply the existence of a garbage dump in the Kidron Valley near the Temple Mount. The existence of this refuse pit that I point to here near the stream of the Kidron Valley, its western bank, and its special finds from the Iron Age, which is the biblical period, and indicates this refuse pit came from the Temple Mount. They're throwing stuff down, not onto the place where the temple was, but from the temple area downward. Now, one of the things these authors say is that Jesus said that every stone within the temple would be destroyed. And that's why you go to the city of David, and there are no archaeological remains of the temple, because, hallelujah, God said there wouldn't be any. But let me say, Jesus did not say that all of the temple complex would be destroyed, only the temple buildings. Let's look at his statement. Here it is in Matthew 24:1, and Jesus came out from the temple and was going away with his disciples, and they came up to point out to him the temple buildings. Okay? And he said, "Do you not see all these things?" He means the temple buildings. "I truly say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So what Jesus has reference to is the temple buildings, the place of the temple itself. And indeed, not one stone of the temple itself remained. But the prophecy did not include the temple's foundation stones, retaining walls, platform, which are technically not buildings, and therefore not the structures Jesus made reference to. Only the temple proper and the buildings associated with it were burned and leveled. Jesus could not have had reference to the southern section of the western wall, of Herod's west court because it had not been finished yet. It was only begun after AD 21 and only stopped when Herod had a problem, and then his grandson built it deep into the Tropian Valley, filled it in. But what we're looking at here is that Jesus gave this prophecy his prophecy comes 30 years after, the completion of the wall happened 30 years after Jesus' prophecy. So it wasn't torn down, it was still being finished at that point. Now, Josephus records that the Romans did not remove the temple's foundations. Here's the statement. But for all the rest of the wall of the city, it was so thoroughly laid, even with the ground, by those that dug it up to the foundation. What does that mean? It means that there were military sappers. These are people who dig the foundations up, but they did it to ground level, up to the foundations, no further. The foundations of the walls mentioned by Josephus have been found intact by archaeologists. So that's the only possible interpretation of these passages. Now, Josephus also says that Titus gave orders to his soldiers that they were to dig up the foundations of the Tower of Antonia. And that is something they quickly carried out. The Roman army, in 7 days, overthrew the foundations of the Tower of Antonia. So let's go back to that model for a moment. They destroyed that entire 36-acre fort, according to this theory, in only 7 days. And not just the buildings, but all the walls and its very foundations. Now, can you imagine that would happen to a structure that large? Could that have been done? Okay. And as I said, these references that they make toward this fort do not fit the first century, the time of Jesus, the time of Herod when this was built. They fit a much later time. And even the reference to this 600-foot bridges has been misconstrued. It's a reference to the northern western porticos of the Temple Mount. If you just go get any version of Josephus and read that, you'll see that. All right? Now, there is an abundant archaeological evidence for the site of the ancient temples at the Temple Mount and nowhere else. This is unanimous verdict of all Israeli archaeologists who have excavated the sites since 1968. The authors of the temple in the city of David theory did not interact with this massive amount of data. For instance, Martin, in his reconstruction, shows in the area of the Ophel the double and triple gates. We can go to those today, and the excavations were right here. You can see them. Here is the remains of the double gate. Here's some ornamentation from within the double gate, which is why many scholars believe this is called the Beautiful Gate in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 3, where Peter and John met the lame beggar, because it was so richly ornated. But we know this, that these gates, the double gate and the triple gate, exist till now. And they were ascended to from the Pool of Siloam way down in the valley. Now, the function of the Huldah gates, these double and triple gates, is what's very important. The double gate was for purified Jews who had gone to the ritual immersion pools, were in a state of ritual purification, and therefore qualified to enter the Temple Mount. And then those who were not in that state after they had been to the temple and offered the sacrifice left by that same gate. This is part of the history. The function of these gates related strictly to the temple. And you have these immersion pools called mikvot right there between these steps so that those coming to the temple could have that ritual purification. How could this be part of a Roman fort? Romans didn't ritually immerse themselves. They weren't involved in ritual purification. They didn't go to the temple. So it doesn't fit. Now, the evidence of these mikvot, these immersion pools, is very important, and also the water systems of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. See, this theory says that there's no water on the Temple Mount, no available source for it like this, so you have to go down to the Gihon Spring and have this gushing water. But if you look right here outside the southern steps of the Temple Mount, you see all of these large mikvot. These are all ritual immersion pools. What are they there for? If not for someone to immerse themselves to go to the temple. We have under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it was only recently revealed because the Al-Aqsa Mosque was destroyed in 1927 by an earthquake. It was rebuilt. In the process, A British archaeologist named Robert Hamilton worked for the Islamic Waqf, the Muslim authorities. They allowed him to do all kind of archaeological findings, but any finding that was inconvenient to the Muslims was suppressed, and only later was this revealed. And we now know that beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there was a Byzantine church. And we know beneath the Byzantine church was a purification ritual pool dating back to the Second Temple period. Apparently Jews maintained this as a place for immersion when entering the temple grounds. You can see where it is in relationship to the Dome of the Rock. We have mikvot right at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount, large ones. And just a few years ago, Ali Shukran discovered this first temple period reservoir, 66,000 gallons, used by pilgrims coming to the temple. This is not in the city of David. This is right there at the Temple Mount. And if we think more about this, where did the water come from for the temple area? It came from these reservoirs that were south of Bethlehem called Solomon's Pools. And you have the whole aqueduct system that conveyed this to there. It says in Tractate Yoma of the Jerusalem Talmud, the temple was cleansed by the abundant, never-ending water supply from the spring of Etam, located near Bethlehem, transported to the temple by means of an aqueduct. And we have these aqueducts. We can see them. We know where they went. Then we know on the Temple Mount there's 37 known water cisterns. And these were filled with rainwater, which is living water. And I'll explain that in just a moment too, because some of these authors don't seem to understand what living water is. But you can see them here. Here's a cutaway that shows the same thing. These cisterns are in blue. And interesting enough, right beneath the Dome of the Rock, there is a spring. This was discovered by Edward Robertson. It's a spring called Ash Safa. We're located 80 feet below the Dome of the Rock. And it gushes up at certain times. It's mentioned in the Talmud, in Tractate Tamid and Midot, and it's thought to be located not far today from Cistern 30 on the Temple Mount. But from time to time, waters have erupted within the site. And the last recorded instance is around 1999, when there's all these reports of water pouring out from the Dome of the Rock. Okay, so it erupts at times. So there certainly is a water source there. But all over the Temple Mount, there's this. Remember in Ezekiel, he talks about in the future water, behold, was flowing from under the threshold of the house. So where's the source for this? None other than that very spring. Now, there was a bridge that was part of Wilson's Arch, and it carried water via an aqueduct to from Solomon's Pools to the Temple Mount. And we still have remains of Wilson's Arch and that aqueduct. There's a great sea cistern under the Temple Mount that held over 2 million gallons of water. And as I said, there's others like this that have this. Here is Hezekiah's Pool, located not far. You can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the background, other places. It's visible from outside Jaffa Gate. We have also, from a model of Conrad Schick, we know where the cisterns are located right beneath the platform of the Temple Mount. His model shows these features and shows that there were rock-cut rooms with a channel that leads in both directions to the Kidron and the Tropian Valley to carry blood and refuse from slaughtering. And here's pictures from the model. I worked very hard to get these. These are not available to the public. He made this model in the 1800s. It's now at Christ Church near Jaffa Gate, but it had to be taken apart. This was only photographed when you took away the buildings on top. Now you can see the cisterns that he examined. He was the only person in history that the Muslim authorities allowed to do this kind of work, to go underneath all these structures and map them out. And he made this model on that basis. It's the best model we have for this. Here's another picture that shows the cisterns. And you can see in the background the Dome of the Rock and all these cisterns that are available, large ones, small ones, all there. So there's no doubt there was abundant water. But more than that, out near Christ Church also, there is an aqueduct beneath the floor. It's the east branch that went from Jaffa Gate toward Wilson's Arch on the western side of the Temple Mount, and possibly served the first temple, a pilgrim cistern, as well as part of the Jewish quarter. And that, you can't go in today, but it's been discovered. Then we have the Hasmonean Aqueduct, which is part of today the temple tunnel, or beneath the present Temple Mount, that did the same thing in the Hasmonean period. Now, living water, they've said you got to have flowing, gushing water. That's living water. That's not living water. Judaism distinguishes between common water and living water. Common water is water that's been transported or lifted by hand, and any stored water fits this category. Living water does not mean flowing or moving water or fresh water, but water that comes directly from the hand of God. And this identification gives it a sense of divine efficacy or potency for ritual cleansing. Water from rainfall, from a spring or a river, constitutes living water. Therefore, rainwater or spring water channeled from a source into a cistern or a mikveh is living water and useful for ritual purification. And that's exactly what you have on the present historic Temple Mount. All right. Now, we also have archaeological evidence of the destruction of the temple and of temple-related structures from the historic Temple Mount. Let's move to what we know. This is Ronnie Reich, who excavated in this area from 1993 to 1998. And this is what he says. The stones being revealed are the remains of the Temple Mount. The temple stood in the center, of which nothing survived. But the Temple Mount and the big Herodian enclosure, this is what you see there fallen and destroyed. This is important. You can only see it here. And we can see this. If you go now, this is the western wall on the southern side. You can see where the stones fell, were pushed down by the Romans right into the street. This wasn't the destruction of the Antonia Fortress, because its foundations were completely removed. These are the stones from the Temple Mount. How do we know that? Well, here's an example of one of those stones. We read, Josephus tells us, this is from his Jewish War, he records that there was a corner of the Temple Mount where it was the custom for one of the priests to stand and to give notice by sound of the trumpet in the afternoon and on the approach of the following evening of the close of every seventh day. So to announce Shabbat, opening and closing, a person would stand at this particular place and sound the trumpet. At the bottom of that site, in the excavations, they found this stone. Any of you who have been there have seen that. This is called the place of trumpeting inscription. Written on it is something that says, to the place of trumpeting, which means this is where the priest is to stand and blow his trumpet. Now here is where that stone was found the day of its discovery. You can see they removed the soil, but it's right there in situ. I've got two pictures of it, one by Lean Rittmeyer, who was part of the excavations. Some of those who write these books holding to the city of David theory say, this is a very difficult thing, because we have Josephus saying this was part of the temple, and there it is. It's not in the city of David, it's here. And some of these have said, well, it was brought up from the city of David. It could not have been brought up from the city of David, because these pictures show right where it was when it was discovered. So it was there, all right? We also have what we call Warren's Gate. This is located, this is the way it looked originally. It now has been relocated within the Western Wall tunnels. This is Warren's Gate today. This is the gate through which Yehuda Getz and Rabbi Goren went looking for the Ark of the Covenant, because they believed they were close to the Holy of Holies. This is the way it looked when it was opened. The government had it sealed because they knew it was that volatile, but they went in at this point. Okay. Now, below Robinson's Arch here on the southwestern wall, they found the Netanyahu Seal from the 8th century. Right there beneath that. Okay. Indicates Jewish presence, Jewish activity there. Not a Roman fort, but Jewish activity. Hezekiah's royal seal was found right here in the Ophel. Okay. This is the king of Judah. Elat Mazar, granddaughter of Benjamin Mazar, who did the excavations around the Temple Mount, found the Solomonic Wall in the Ophel, not the city of David, in the Ophel. This is the extension wall that Solomon created to enclose part of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. She also found in the Ophel this particular medallion, and this medallion is on the eve of the Muslim invasion, but notice it has a menorah, it has a shofar, it has probably part of a Torah scroll, and they believe it was a part of the cover of a Torah scroll for people who were having a service there. They weren't having that service in the city of David. They were having it right there at the foot of the Temple Mount. It's as close as they could come. Here's another important stone that was found. We know that there was a warning stone called on the Soreg, this fence that separated the court of the Gentiles from the place where Jews would go. And we have this warning stone. This is the only intact one. It was found during the Ottoman period and transferred to the Istanbul Museum. And so it's written in Greek to warn Gentiles not to enter. But this was found in 1871 by Charles Clermont Ganneau outside the Lion's Gate. That's just on the northeast side of the Temple Mount. Okay, and another fragment of it was found in 1936, also in the Lion's Gate. All right, now these things are not the city of David again. These came from the Temple Mount. Also, we have evidence of an ascent staircase to the Temple Mount, an escape tunnel from the Temple Mount. Let me just go quickly through this. We know now that we have this massive stairway connecting the Pool Siloam and the southern steps of the Temple Mount. Why there? Because pilgrims would immerse themselves or be at the Pool Siloam, they go up to the temple. If there's no temple there, what are those steps doing there? Okay, why do we have this massive entrance? Here are the steps to the Temple Mount. More than that, we have from the Pool Siloam, which we now know. From that, there is also this tunnel, but under the tunnel, or under the stairway, there's a tunnel. It's called an escape tunnel. When this was discovered, it was quite amazing. And you can see it here. What happened is that they broke, during the Roman conquest of the Temple Mount, Jews who were on the Temple Mount tried to escape with their lives, and they entered the sewer, which was there, and they went into the sewer and they hid out, and they took cooking pots and things to keep them alive, food in the cooking pots. And Josephus tells us exactly what happened, that the Romans broke into the bottom of this staircase and found this sewer and killed the Jews that were there. But you find all of this is exactly the way it was, according to the historical sources. And Rodney Reich says this is exactly what happened when the Romans broke in, found the historical text, and the archaeological points to the same episode right here. And this thing emerges right under Robinson's Arch. So it's clearly right there at the Temple Mount. They're going from the Temple Mount, trying to escape down into the Kidron Valley. In this tunnel, when they were excavating, they found this inscribed menorah, probably a priest who had seen it in the temple and left that behind. They also found this seal, which says pure for God. And it was used by the priest basically to designate things that were ceremonially pure. Okay, what are these things doing in there? Well, these are clearly Jews and related to the temple. And very interestingly, they found this gold bell, which is part of the bell on the priest's garment, okay, which we know is there. And that was also found there. Now, we also have archaeological evidence of the location of the temple in a very interesting way. This is a publication about a Byzantine structure that was excavated on the Temple Mount right outside the southern wall. And we know what it is. We know it was the Monastery of the Virgins. We have that in the literature. But it says under this building was the remains of a Second Temple period structure that was identified in the Mishnah as the courthouse that sat at the entrance to the temple. And you can look at this structure, and you can see it's a Herodian construction, okay, at the time of Jesus. And this is there, and in it they found this stone, which has the translation elders. This is the Sanhedrin. They met in that court. They met right there, not in the city of David, but right there at the Temple Mount. Now, the Muslims have helped us with this too. They have, in their construction, inadvertently revealed things related to the temple. You can see this excavation where they were digging things up on the Temple Mount. And in one of these, as they were trying to lay electrical cable, they revealed a portion of a wall. And in it, near the wall, were these fragments of pottery. And the pottery are from a ladling vessel for oil, and they're dated to the 8th century BC. And putting this together, it looks like this is the wall of the southeast corner of the court where there was the house of oil. So if you put this together with a map of what the first temple could have looked like, where it would have sat, this particular archaeological thing fits that and gives us some indication of things. More than that, the Muslims started building the Almawani Mosque, and this is right behind the southern wall, what we call Solomon's Stables, and they took out some 20,000 tons of archaeologically rich debris. Well, they threw this into the Kidron Valley in places, and the Israelis didn't waste any time getting to that. And they've been sifting on this for 10 years. It's something called the Temple Mount Sifting Project. And 50% of the pottery finds from the first and second temples. And my team from Liberty University went there, and we dealt with what we call the Pope's dirt. This is what came directly from the Temple Mount. And the first day we found these murex shells. These murex shells are where you get the chelet, the biblical blue, for dyeing the priest's garments. This is strictly a Jewish industry. They found, among other things, we found some of this too, this opus sectile. We know from the Talmud that inside the women's court, it said it looked like the waves of the sea. These different colored tiles that were there. These are the very tiles. Came from the Temple Mount. Fits the sources. You find these half-shekel coins that say, first year of the Great Revolt or Holy Jerusalem on them, on the Temple Mount. Why would those be in a Roman fort? Just wouldn't be. So what I've tried to do is put together evidence from history, tradition, from the location itself, from the archaeological remains, and let you draw your own conclusion. So let me just cite this from a law case. It says this: in English law, the citizen is regarded as being a free man of good repute. So all our authors who write a contrary view, we certainly want to give them that regard. Issues may be raised in civil action which affect character and reputation, and these will not be forgotten by judges and juries when considering the probabilities in regard to whatever misconduct is alleged. There will be reluctance to rob any man of his good name. There will also be reluctance to make any man pay for what is not due, or to make any man liable who is not, or not liable who is. A court will not be deterred from a conclusion because of regret at its consequences. A court must arrive at such conclusion as directed by the weight and preponderance of the evidence. Okay, I think I've given you a preponderance of evidence to help you make this decision. So let me just add in closing some resources that can help you. Gordon Franz has written a 48-page critique of the temple by Robert Cornuke, which is available from this website. You can download it free. And that'll go point by point and answer some of the questions many of you have. There's also the book by Eileen Rittmeyer called The Quest, and that's available here, right outside those doors, okay, in the general bookstore. It's probably the best book on locating the temple. And by the way, books like Robert Cornuke and the others never mention Eileen Rittmeyer. This is the chief book on this, and it's not even dealt with. And then, humbly, may I say, I have a book or two on this. Out at our table, we have Rose's Guide to the Temple by me. And then we have something very exciting in my mind. We spent 3 years going to the Temple Mount, because today on the Temple Mount, you cannot talk about the Temple Mount. The Muslim authorities say it's forbidden. Jews can't go up there and pray. Christians can't open the Bible. You can't even wear a T-shirt with a picture of anything that relates to Christianity or Judaism or even history, for that matter. You can't bring your Bible up there. It's very restrictive. We used hidden cameras and hidden microphones, and I taught all about the temple all over the Temple Mount. Of course, get thrown off all the time, but I kept coming back, and we finished this. And so you now is also shot in 360 degrees, so this is a computer program. You put it in your computer, you can do your own tour of the Temple Mount. You can go wherever you want to, whenever you want to, turn forwards, backwards, jump over walls, go into things. There are data things you can download. There are maps you can get to. And there are like 50 clips of me teaching on location. We did this for the temple. We did it for the tabernacle model, which is down in Timna Park. So you can now tour through the tabernacle. You ever go down there, it's blazing hot. You can sit in your cool living room and go through at your leisure all of these things. We did it for the place at Shiloh. We also did it for the Mount of Olives, did it for the Guard Tomb. So you can see this. And it's done in 4 languages, by the way: English, German, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so this is available out at our table. Well, thank you for being an attentive audience. I know it's been a lot of material, but I hope we've done what we set out to do, and that was to defend the historic Temple Mount.